Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you're hitting the gym, really putting in the work, focused on building muscle. And naturally, you start thinking about food, right? Especially protein.
Always protein.
Exactly. And for years, years, the golden rule has basically been you want muscle. You need animal protein.
Steak, chicken, whey. Yeah, the usual suspects.
The whole shebang. But what if that's not quite the whole picture?
Okay.
What if you could actually get the same results, muscle-wise, whether you're eating, say, steak or soybeans?
That's a big question.
It is. And we've got some really fascinating research here based on some articles you share that might just, flip how you think about protein and gains.
Yeah, let's dive into it.
Let's do it. See what it means for, everyone listening and their fitness goals.
So today, we're really taking a deep dive into that exact question. If you're serious about building muscle, does it actually matter if your protein comes from animals or plants?
Right. Source matters. Or not.
And another angle, does when you eat that protein throughout the day play a big role?
Oh, yeah, protein timing. That's another classic debate.
Exactly. So we'll be looking at two key scientific studies that investigated these questions, but in different groups of people.
Different populations.
Yeah. And our goal is really to synthesize their findings, pull them together, and give you a clear picture of what the science is actually saying right now.
Okay, so lay out the sources for us. You mentioned two studies.
That's right. First, you shared that Health News article, I think it was from April 2025.
Yeah, sounds right.
It reported on a new study led by Professor Nicholas Bird. He's at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.
Yeah.
And their work, published in Medicine and Science, in Sports and Exercise, focused on young, active adults.
Got it, young adults. And the second?
The second is a research paper, this one from the Journal of Nutrition, also published in 2025. It's by Jacinta Domich and colleagues over at Wageningen University in the Netherlands.
Okay, Wageningen. And who did they study?
They looked at older, active adults. So a different demographic, but tackling similar questions.
Similar questions about protein source.
Yeah.
And its effect on, what was the term? Muscle protein synthesis.
Exactly. Muscle protein synthesis. That's basically the body's process for building new muscle tissue. Both studies zeroed in on that.
All right. So what's our mission today with these?
Pretty straightforward, really. We want to pull out the key findings, explain them in plain language, no jargon.
Definitely.
Discuss what they actually imply for your muscle building efforts. And importantly, talk about any limitations.
Right. Context is crucial.
Context is crucial. And we'll fold in some expert opinions, too, just to give everyone that well-rounded understanding.
Perfect. So where should we start? Maybe with the University of Illinois study, Professor Bird's work on younger adults.
Yeah, let's start there. What were they really trying to pin down?
Well, like you said, they were challenging that that long-held assumption about animal protein being superior.
Right. The news article mentioned some earlier, smaller studies that looked at muscle samples maybe after just one meal. And those suggested, maybe animal protein gives a bigger kickstart to muscle protein synthesis.
But just one meal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Professor Bird made that point. Looking at one meal might not tell you the whole story about how a whole diet affects muscle growth over time.
That makes a lot of sense. A short-term boost after eating a steak is one thing, but what happens day after day, especially if you're on a, say, mostly plant-based diet?
Precisely. So they designed the study. It ran for 9 days.
9 days, okay.
And they had 40 healthy, physically active young adults participating.
And what do they eat?
They split them up. One group followed a diet where about 70% of the protein came from animal sources, beef, pork, chicken, dairy, eggs.
The typical omnivore diet, pretty much.
Pretty much. The other group followed a vegan diet. But, and this is key, it was a carefully designed vegan diet. Meaning it included a variety of plant foods to ensure they were getting what we call complete proteins, all those essential amino acids, the building blocks.
Okay, so they weren't just eating, like, lettuce.
Definitely not. They made sure the quality was there on the vegan side, too.
And you mentioned protein timing earlier. They looked at that, too.
Yes, that was the other layer. Within both the animal protein group and the vegan group, they split them again.
Yeah.
One subgroup ate their protein unevenly, like 10% at breakfast, 30% at lunch, and a big 60% whack at dinner.
Skewed towards the evening.
Right. The other subgroup spread it out much more evenly, 20% of their daily total across 5 different eating times.
Interesting. And they were all working out.
Yep, resistance training every 3 days during the study. Crucial component.
So it sounds really controlled. How did they actually measure the muscle building?
They used a pretty cool technique. It involves something called deuterium oxide.
Heavy water.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
It's water with a slightly heavier type of hydrogen. Participants drank this daily. And the researchers could then track how those heavier hydrogen atoms got incorporated, first into new amino acids, and then eventually into actual muscle tissue.
Wow.
They took tiny muscle samples biopsies at the start and end of the 9 days.
Ouch. But necessary, I guess.
Necessary to directly measure the rate of what's called myofibrillar protein synthesis. Think of that as the speed your body is assembling new muscle fibers.
Okay, direct measurement. So after the 9 days, after the heavy water and the biopsies, what did they find? Did the animal protein group build more muscle?
This is where it gets really interesting. Professor Bird and his team, according to the report, were actually quite surprised.
Yeah.
They found no significant differences. None.
No difference between the vegan group and the omnivore group.
In the rates of muscle protein synthesis, no. It essentially didn't seem to matter whether the protein came primarily from animals or plants as long as the total amount was sufficient.
Wow. Okay, that seriously challenges the common wisdom, doesn't it?
It really does.
What about the timing? Did spreading the protein out evenly make a difference compared to loading up in the evening?
That was the other surprise. Nope.
Really?
The way they distributed their protein intake skewed or even also had no significant impact on muscle protein synthesis. And that held true for both the vegan and the omnivorous groups.
So let me get this straight. For these young active adults, this study suggests as long as you're eating enough protein overall, the source, animal or plant, might not matter much.
Yeah.
And when you eat, it might not matter that much either.
That's pretty much the main takeaway from that University of Illinois study. Professor Bird's quote in the article was quite direct. He said something like, "It's the kind you put in your mouth after exercise. As long as you're getting sufficient high-quality protein, then it really doesn't make a difference."
Doesn't make a difference. That's strong. Okay. Now, you also brought in that other paper, the one from Agningen University, looking at older adults.
Right. Chantha Domich and colleagues.
Did they find something similar, or was it different for an older group?
Well, they're asking a similar question, but yeah, focus on adults age 65 to 79, active ones, though.
Okay. And what was their specific concern?
Their concern, which they mention in the paper, stems from that idea that plant proteins are often considered lower quality.
Why lower quality?
Potentially less digestible, maybe not having the same perfect balance of essential amino acids as animal proteins.
The amino acid profile.
Exactly. And this could be a bigger deal for older adults who are naturally fighting against age-related muscle loss.
Sarcopenia.
Well, that's the term, sarcopenia. It's a major health issue for older people.
Increases risk of falls, hospitalizations.
Yeah, absolutely. So these researchers specifically wanted to see if a well-balanced vegan diet, emphasis on well-balanced, would actually hinder muscle protein synthesis compared to an omnivorous diet in this older population.
Okay, so how do they set up their study? Similar to the Illinois one.
Similar principles, but a slightly different design. They use what's called a crossover study. 34 older adults each went through 2 10-day dietary periods.
Okay, 10 days each.
Yeah.
Longer than the other study.
A little bit longer, yeah. In one period, they followed a strictly controlled vegan diet. In the other period, a strictly controlled omnivorous diet.
And controlled means?
Controlled means the researchers made sure both diets provided the exact same number of total calories.
Isocaloric.
Right. And the same total amount of protein.
Isonitrogenous.
You got it. So total energy and total protein were matched. In the omnivore phase, about 60% of that protein came from animal sources.
So again, just like the Illinois study, they made absolutely sure the amount of protein was the same, regardless of the source.
Crucial point. They provided all the meals, actually.
Oh, wow. Full catering.
Yep. And they made sure the vegan diet wasn't just random plants. It had a good mix. Soy alternatives, beans, nuts, cereals, even plant-based meat substitutes.
A varied vegan diet.
Very varied. And like the other study, they used deuterium oxide, the heavy water.
To track muscle protein synthesis.
Exactly. Over those 10-day periods, tracking how that heavy hydrogen ended up in muscle proteins found in blood and muscle tissue samples.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
So, the results in this older active group, vegan versus omnivore.
Okay, again, really interesting. Despite those theoretical concerns about plant protein quality, especially for older adults, they found no significant difference.
Again.
No significant difference in the overall rates of muscle protein synthesis between the vegan diet period and the omnivorous diet period over the 10 days.
That's pretty remarkable. So similar findings in young adults and older active adults.
It seems that way. When total protein intake is sufficient and the diet is, reasonably well planned, the source didn't appear to be a limiting factor for building muscle protein.
Did the Wegening study look at anything else besides the muscle aspect?
They did, yeah. They also measured some cardiometabolic health markers, things related to heart health.
Okay, like what?
Cholesterol, for instance. They found that the vegan diet period led to significantly lower levels of LDL cholesterol. That's the so-called bad cholesterol.
Lower LDL on the vegan diet? That's generally seen as good, right?
Generally, yes. And lower total cholesterol levels, too, compared to the omnivorous diet period.
Interesting. Any other changes?
They did see a small decrease in HDL cholesterol, the good kind, with the vegan diet, but they noted it was a small change and probably not clinically significant.
Okay.
And they didn't find any significant differences in other things like triglycerides, blood sugar, insulin levels, or blood pressure between the two diet phases.
So if I'm hearing this right, in this study of older adults, the well-planned vegan diet not only didn't hurt muscle protein synthesis compared to the omnivore diet,
Correct.
but it also seemed to improve their cholesterol profile.
That's what their data suggests. The researchers themselves propose that the high levels of plant sterols, natural plant compounds, and the complete lack of dietary cholesterol in the vegan diet likely contributed to lowering the LDL.
Which fits with a lot of other research on vegan diets and heart health.
It does align well, yes.
Okay, so we have these two studies, different age groups, similar setup in controlling protein intake, and surprisingly similar results regarding muscle protein synthesis.
Seems that way.
It really feels like the evidence is pointing towards total protein being the bigger player than the source, at least in these contexts. But, no study is perfect. We always need to talk about the caveats, the limitations. What should we keep in mind here?
That's super important, absolutely. For the University of Illinois study, while it was very tightly controlled, 9 days is still pretty short.
Right. 9 days tells you about the rate of synthesis, but maybe not long-term muscle growth or strength changes over months or years.
Exactly. You can't necessarily extrapolate long-term gains from a 9-day snapshot. And the Wageningen study, even though it had those 10-day phases, faces a similar limitation regarding long-term effects.
Makes sense. What else?
The Wageningen researchers themselves highlighted something important about their vegan diet.
What was that?
They stressed that their vegan diet was carefully planned to ensure high-quality protein from diverse sources. It might not reflect, how everyone following a vegan diet actually eats day to day.
So a self-planned vegan diet might look different? Maybe lower protein or less variety?
Potentially, yes. If someone just cuts out animal products without carefully replacing the protein and ensuring variety, they might not get the same results. Quality and quantity still matter.
That's a crucial distinction.
It is. They also pointed out they didn't directly measure muscle protein breakdown. Muscle growth is the net balance between synthesis, which they measured, and breakdown.
Right. Synthesis minus breakdown equals net gain or loss.
Precisely. So they only looked at one side of that equation directly.
Those were really important points. So just switching to a vegan diet without paying attention to getting enough varied protein might not lead to these same outcomes for muscle.
Absolutely. The overall quality and, crucially, the total amount of protein consumed are still paramount, regardless of the source.
It's not magic.
It's not magic. The Wageningen paper even mentioned another study where people on a self-chosen, low-fat vegan diet actually ended up unintentionally cutting their total calories and protein.
And what happened?
They lost lean body mass over time, which really underscores the need to be mindful of getting adequate protein and overall energy, especially if you adopt a vegan eating pattern.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this. Bringing it all together, what's the core message for someone listening right now thinking about their protein intake and muscle goals?
Yeah, let's boil it down. What this seems to mean for you is this. Both of these studies, looking at younger folks and older folks, they landed on a pretty similar conclusion.
Which is?
When your total protein intake is high enough and your overall diet is reasonably well balanced, the actual source of that protein, whether it's mostly animal or mostly plant-based, doesn't seem to make a huge difference to the rate your body builds muscle protein after weight training.
Okay. Source matters less than quantity, assuming quality is decent.
That seems to be the gist. And remember, the Illinois study also suggested that spreading your protein evenly versus concentrating it didn't seem to have a major effect either, at least over those 9 days.
Right. And the Wageningen study added that bonus finding about cholesterol in older adults.
Exactly. The well-planned vegan diet didn't compromise muscle protein synthesis and came with some potential cardiovascular benefits.
But we absolutely have to remember the limitations we just discussed.
Absolutely. The Illinois study was short, 9 days.
And the Wageningen study, while a bit longer per phase, used a very carefully constructed vegan diet that might not be typical for everyone.
Right. And neither study directly measured muscle breakdown. Those are important pieces of context.
Professor Bird's quote really stuck with me, though.
Which one?
As long as you're getting sufficient high-quality protein from your food, then it really doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, that sums it up pretty well, doesn't it? It aligns nicely with the findings from both studies. The focus shifts to hitting your overall protein target with a variety of whole foods.
Whether those foods moo, cluck, or grow in the ground.
Pretty much.
So maybe a call to action for listeners. Think about your own diet, your fitness routine. Have you been maybe overly worried about getting protein only from animal sources?
Or fixated on hitting a protein shake right after a workout.
Right. These studies suggest maybe a broader view is warranted. Focus on getting enough total protein consistently from varied sources you enjoy and can stick with. That might be more effective.
Maybe even, experiment a little. Try incorporating more plant-based protein sources, beans, lentils, tofu, nuts, seeds, while making sure you're still hitting your overall protein number. See how your body feels, how it responds.
Yeah, personalize it.
Exactly. And it leads to a final thought, perhaps a bit provocative.
Go on.
If the source of protein matters less than we've traditionally thought, what other strongly held beliefs about diet and exercise might be worth, re-examining?
Good question. Like maybe strict meal timing isn't the be-all and end-all either, based on that Illinois finding.
Could be. Perhaps the real key to optimal fitness isn't about rigid dogma, but finding a more flexible, personalized approach. One that prioritizes overall dietary quality, consistency, and just enough good stuff.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other nutritional assumptions out there are maybe ripe for a fresh look based on emerging science? Something for everyone to mull over.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.